I'll begin with the brief housekeeping remarks.
Okay.
Shall we go ahead and start?
Yes, we should. 11:31. Go for it.
Perfect. Great. So good morning, everyone. My name is Lisa Tanaka. I'm Senior Public Affairs Manager in Legislative and Public Affairs. And this morning, our meeting is offered via Zoom and conference call. If you'd like to raise your hand,
Thank you.
You can do so by clicking the button, raise your hand at the bottom during public comment, and we'll indicate when it is public comment. Also, if you're on the phone, you can click *9, and that also raises your hand for public comment. With that, we'll try to do our best to make this meeting run as smooth as possible. And with that, Supervisor Rutherford, if you'd like to take it away.
Terrific. Thank you, Lisa. Appreciate everyone being here today. Do we have a quorum? Are we ready to start? Or do we need to take roll first? Anyone know?
We don't have a quorum yet.
All right, so we can't do the minutes yet, but I think we're safe starting with some presentations. So why don't we dive into item number 4, and then we'll come back up and do 2 and 3 later. So is Jill with us, or who's doing our budget presentation?
I am. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hello. Thank you for having me at your meeting today. I'm going to provide an abbreviated version of a presentation that was given last week to the board. Basically, we've been doing monthly updates to the governing board and the administrative committee to keep a close eye on our budget and economic outlook. Can you go to the next slide, please? So you'll see that at the beginning of this presentation, we're going to talk about economic indicators and some of the items that we're looking at. So slide 3, please. We're looking at things on a state and federal level, just to kind of get a general idea of the economy, and then we're watching a number of South Coast metrics. So I'll stay on this slide for just a moment. We're looking both year to year, comparing each month, and the next slide will show the year to date. But you can go back to the previous slide, thank you. So 2 of the key things that we're tracking for industry health are looking at the statewide refinery activity, and that's the million barrels of crude oil input. And we're tracking how many millions of barrels. You can see July is lower than the July a year ago, but we're actually seeing a little bit of an improvement in that trend. The other indicator that we're looking at is the port throughput, and these are millions of the TEUs, or the units that they measure. And we actually, for the first time since we've been tracking this in March and April, saw an increase month over month. Long Beach actually had their highest month ever, and Los Angeles had their second July ever. So things are looking a little better there. Unemployment, which has been horrible, is improving slightly. We're about 13.3% currently, and it was up close to 15% last month. Okay, now we can go to slide 4. Year to date, we're also looking at the gross domestic product. That hasn't changed much over the last month, but it is significantly down compared to a year ago. The refinery activity, similarly, trends were about the same reduction, 14.5%, 15% lower year to date, cumulatively, than we were last year. And the port throughput continues to be down when you look at the January through July, but as I'd mentioned, it's trending up. Okay, so we can go to the next slide, please. One of the key things that we're looking at is our staffing levels. We have 945 budgeted positions. We currently have a little over a 16% vacancy rate. If you're familiar with our budget, this year and last year, we are maintaining a 10% vacancy rate for our fiscal overall health, but previously we generally run about an 8% vacancy rate. So we are about twice as high as typical, or where we would like to be, and we're starting to feel some stress and stretching. So we may have to start, have a little bit of thawing around the edges, I'm calling it, of our hiring freeze, which we've had for a number of months. But we have to be very careful because our payroll is one of our very largest expenses. So managing the vacancy rate is one of the ways we're making sure that we're being fiscally prudent. So we can go to the next slide, please. One of the things we're looking at is the emission trends. The total emissions from all of our reported sources is about $20 million a year. And we're seeing a trend. We're looking here at the NOx major emission sources that have continuous monitors, which is a good indication of how everyone is faring. And if you're looking at NOx, you can see once COVID hit, we're seeing some decreases. And this could result in about 10% to 15% lower emissions and about a $2 to $3 million a year budget hit. Or I'm sorry, $3 to $4 million compared to last year. Slide 7, please. A similar revenue category are incoming applications. This is for new equipment or permit modifications, changes of ownership. We're seeing significantly lower permitting activity with the exception of July. Orange is the current year, and you can see that it's trending lower. The August numbers are preliminary because it takes a little bit of time before we can actually get all of those in the door. So that might be a little bit higher, but this also could be about a $3 to $4 million reduction in our annual budget. Next slide, slide 8, please. We're watching the permit revenue. So you can see the blue line is fiscal year 18-19. The orange is the fiscal year 19-20, and then we have 2 months into the current fiscal year, which are the gray dots and bar on the lower side. And you can see that we are trending down. This is all permit revenue for the annual renewals, and this is about a $60 million revenue stream for us. So we're watching this very closely. Oh, I'm so sorry. This is the $20 million revenue. The next slide, slide 9, is the annual operating fee, which is about a $60 million. That's actually trending pretty closely so far. So that's actually a good sign. We were a little bit low in August, but one of the key things that we're keeping an eye on. Can we go to slide 10, please? One of the things that we saw a real uptick in are the fee review committee requests. This is a group of employees that represent management or above from different departments in AQMD, and it's set up to primarily issue payment plans for people that need to renew their permits or correct errors that the district has either caused or contributed to when there's some dispute that goes. And typically we just get a handful of them a month, and you saw in April 37 fee review court requests. It's come down a little bit. It looks a little bit closer to typical levels. One of the things we did right away was to streamline the process, because the fee review committee usually meets once a month, and they review the cases, and the vast majority of the requests for payment plans are issued. So we gave the authority that we can issue payment plans if it's less than $10,000 at stake right away. So when someone puts in a request now for a payment plan, they can get up to 6 months interest-free to pay their permit fees and any other associated fees. And so that has really expedited that. It's one of the many things we're doing to try and help businesses during this time. And can we go to slide 11? We're also tracking the number of permits that expire by month. Again, the blue is the fiscal year 2018-19, and these are actual permits that did expire. The reason that permits expire, sometimes people don't need that equipment. They've replaced it with something differently. They have gone out of business, or they just have let those permits go for their business opportunities. The orange line in fiscal year 2019 and 20, there's a lot of circles with dashes around them. And that indicates potentially expired permits, because people have 1 year to reinstate a permit after it potentially goes, it expires because they didn't pay the annual renewal fees. We don't like the trend. You can see that May, June, July, and August are very high. We are contacting these companies to make sure that they're aware that they can get a payment plan. Many of these companies in July and August, a very large number are due to a handful of companies with many permits. So it's not 390 businesses in August. It's probably closer to 250 businesses, give or take a little bit. So we're reaching out to these companies to make sure that they understand that we can offer them a payment plan, and we'll be happy to work with them on that. Next slide, please. So the last metric that we're looking at is also sort of a generic category of the CEQA documents that AQMD receives that our staff can review and provide comments on, the number per month. This kind of gives an indication of the general health of the economy and the state of construction. And you can see again for 2020, the orange line, it's significantly below in most months the number of documents received in the previous year. And the previous year was very consistent. We looked at a longer term trend. So that's another metric that we're tracking. Next slide, please. We end the presentation with the same slides just for your ease of reference with the monthly and the year-to-date comparisons. And we are keeping a very watchful eye on this. So far, I'd say we're doing okay. It's typical that we see a lag of 12 to 18 months when there is an economic downturn. So it's why we're keeping such a really tight eye on everything. And we will continue to report each month to the board and the admin committee. So that's the conclusion of the presentation. And I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Lorna? I'm not seeing any. Oh, wait, I see a hand from Mark.
Okay. Jill, who sits on the review committee?
Well, I'm going to you for a moment. We're getting a lot of feedback. Everybody could mute without speaking, or if you have two devices on, or you don't have two devices.
Okay, so I believe your question, Bill, was the makeup of the fee review committee.
Yes.
It's made up from representative from most of the major departments. So we have people from finance, from engineering, from legal, from public affairs, and then compliance and enforcement. And then we pull in other folks as needed, depending on the nature of it. If it's a straightforward payment plan or a fee dispute, then we don't need it. But sometimes we need to pull in people from technology development, if it's a dispute about best available control technology or something of that nature. But the vast majority of the issues have to deal with payment of the fees.
And I noticed I don't know where this feedback is. I don't have anything else.
Bill, you're showing up twice, once by phone and once with your computer. Oh,
Yet, but I don't have a mic on the PC, and volume is off. So
it's better now. So maybe it fixed itself.
okay. I noticed in doing my own independent review earlier this year that issuing payment plans or denials were about the only two decisions that the fee committee made. Are there any other options?
Well, I actually served on this committee for a number of years when I was working in engineering and compliance at that time. And I'd say probably 80 or 90% of the cases that come to the committee have to do with it's an incorrect fee, or I need a payment plan, or there's sometimes people ask for consideration of something related to the permit. There are some cases where I mentioned where someone is saying, this is wrong. I should not have received this bill, or I should not have had this permit outcome. So those are not the majority of the cases, but those things come in as well.
Okay. And I was just wondering, there is a penalty associated with not renewing your permit in a timely manner. Does the fee committee have the option of waiving that penalty? And in fact, have they? The reason for my question is in this backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic, there are a lot of small businesses, especially, that are having a lot of difficulty getting cash with the on again, off again opening and closing of their businesses. They're desperate. Cash is king right now. I'm just wondering if the fee committee has thought of exercising any forbearance, considering the merits of a particular case. I'm not talking about a blanket amnesty for that, but I'm just wondering if that is an option that the committee can take, and if they would consider it.
The fee review committee does not have the authority to waive the fees. They're in actually Rule 301. And the annual renewal fees they range for a smaller permit like a dry cleaner, gas station, auto body shop. Those fees can be between $200 and $400 a year. And they range, just for depending on the size of the equipment. Only about 10% or so of the potentially expired permits are small business permits. So we're not seeing an overwhelming thing, but the fee review committee can only waive the fees if we caused or contributed to an error. And so we do send numerous communications to the businesses, and they actually get at least one, sometimes two phone calls. They get a return receipt required thing from the post service. So it's usually there's been multiple attempts. We have had cases where people come in and they say, I never got the return receipt. And we have to pull it out and say, I'm sorry, so-and-so from your company signed it. I remember a couple cases where we thought there was enough confusion that we contributed to an error, but the fees are established in our rule and they're pretty modest. The other thing that we can do now for people is they have the option to pay these fees on a credit card. So they don't have to pay the reinstatement fees if they have a credit card with enough room on it to add, $200 or $300, $400. They can do that, and then they can pay that off, at their own discretion. But the basic answer to your question is, can the fee review committee do it? Unfortunately, no.
Okay. No, I understand, and I think you and I have been present and spoken on this subject several times in the past at different venues. And, I think one of those, at least, I mentioned that I personally don't know of a small business person, certainly none of my members, that has any room in a credit card these days. I mean, everything is just maxed out. Having said that, I am satisfied that the staff is going the extra mile to accommodate the people that come before the fee review committee. I was kind of looking for an opening, but thanks to you, Jill, I'm unable to find one. So keep up the good work. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Bill. I see the chair is back, so I will hand the virtual gavel over to him, noting that we did not have a quorum when we started. So we skipped approval of the minutes. We took the presentation on item 4, but we haven't checked for another quorum to see if there's a vote yet. So all yours, Ben.
Very good. Thank you. And apologize. Our Zoom meetings seem to run a lot longer than our regular meetings with the other board meetings. So, and I tried to see about moving it up, but then they reminded me that Ledge Committee meets first and they would have to move that up too. So we'll probably have to leave it alone unless this body would like to meet on a different day, but I think it's okay if we just keep doing these handoffs. Do we have a quorum now, Madam Clerk?
Yes.
We do? Okay, very good. With that, first thing I guess we need to go back to is item number 2, the approval of the August 14th minutes. Do we have any questions or comments on the minutes from August 14th?
Mr. Chair?
Todd, go ahead.
I apologize. I still had a comment for Jill, but is it too late for that?
For the last item you guys were on, item 4?
Yeah, because I actually had my hand raised on the system, but I guess.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I just, first of all, Jill always does a great job, and thank you for a great presentation. I wanted to note that on page 3 and 4 of her presentation, it says that, port TEU throughput was the highest month ever for Long Beach and the highest July ever for the Port of Los Angeles. And on page 4, it says that both ports are coming off successive years of record-breaking growth. And I just have to say, that's a pretty strong indication that the goods movement sector, despite COVID, is really not having a big impact, despite what various folks may say in charge of the ports of LA and Long Beach. I've heard a lot about how China trade war and COVID and all this is really impacting the industry. I say the numbers say otherwise, and I just wanted to remind the group that our biggest threat to not reaching attainment is heavy duty trucks. And so I think that's something, a very important thing that Jill raised for us to keep in mind, especially when we're thinking about doing indirect source rules. I hope we're picking it up, in the near term. That's it.
Very good. Any other questions or comments on item number 4? All right, with that, I'll go back to item number 2, the approval of August 14th minutes. Do we have a motion or a second on that?
Move approval.
Eddie Martinez, so moved.
Okay, I think I heard Bill there for the motion, and David, did you second that?
Yes, I did.
Okay, very good. Clerk, go ahead and call the roll.
Okay, this is to move the minutes. Mr. Philip Aguirre. Okay. Mayor Pro Tem Arizmendi.
Aye.
Mr. Avila. Mr. Blake. I don't see him. Mr. Campbell.
Aye.
Ms. Daniel.
Aye.
Mr. DeWitt. And Mr. Lamar.
Aye.
Ms. Loof. Ms. Rita Loof. She's frozen. Mr. Marquez.
Aye.
Mr. Rothbart.
Aye.
Supervisor Rutherford.
Aye.
And Chair Benoit.
Aye. Todd, I see your hand still raised. That was for the earlier item, right? Okay. All right. We did go through item number 3 then, Supervisor Rutherford?
No, we didn't do 3.
Okay, the review and follow-up action items. Has Derek joined us? So yes, he has. Go ahead, Derek.
Thank you, Mayor Benoit. A couple action items from the previous meeting. One is provide links for past cost effectiveness analysis by Dr. Fine. Dr. Fine provided the links, which were emailed to the advisory group on Tuesday, August 18th. Additionally, provide a link to register for the 6th Annual Environmental Justice Conference. A link was sent out on August 20th. And those are the action items.
Very good. Comments or questions on the action items? All right. We'll go ahead and go on to item number 5, getting to know the hearing board. And if any of you are listening into the admin committee, we had some amazing candidates for this morning's public alternate member. So
That is
right ahead.
That's great to hear. This is Julie Prusak. I am the chair of the hearing board, and I've been asked to just give you a very quick overview of our hearing board and our process. So just to start, this is a picture of what our hearing board room looks like. It looks a lot like a courtroom, and if you haven't been in there, when we finally get back to the building, please come by and take a look. Next slide, please. So who are we and how do we fit in the district? Because a lot of people really are not very familiar with what we do. First of all, I like to look at it as sort of the 3 branches of government. The governing board, of course, is the legislative or the administrative branch, adopting policy, rules, and budget. Then there's the staff, headed by the executive officer, the executive branch, enforcing and developing rules. And then there's the hearing board, and we are the quasi-judicial branch. We are determining issues of noncompliance and hearing disputes over permits and things like that. Next slide, please. We are also, it's very important to note, we are independent. of the district. A lot of people don't realize that when they come before us either. So where the governing board sits over the executive officer and all of staff, and we're sort of out there on the side. We are independently appointed, etc. And so that helps us because the district is always a party to every matter that we hear, whether it's by petition or they're the petitioner or the respondent. Next slide, please. Who are we? We are set up by the Health and Safety Code. We are 5 members appointed by the governing board. There is an attorney member, a medical doctor member, and an engineer member, and 2 what we call public members, which simply means they don't need to be any of those 3, but they have significant background, expertise in air quality and what we do on the board. We serve, again, a quasi-judicial function. And that means that the members are considered administrative law judges, and everything we do, all of our orders, they are binding, the same as rules and regulation of the district and permits. Members also, though, act as fact finders like a jury, and so we can ask questions, and we do quite a lot. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, can you hear me? Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. Okay, so what rules are applicable to the hearing board? There are several. First of all, everything we are, our jurisdiction, just the setup even of the hearing board is set forth in the Health and Safety Code of California. Also, District Regulation 5, and 8 are our procedures. Just going back, there we are. Set forth our procedural rules. We have our own rules and procedures of the hearing board, and these are very intricate rules. What papers do you need to file, when you need to do that, what motions can you make, etc. And of course, the Brown Act. So every hearing is publicly noticed for the most part, and I'll tell you the exceptions in a moment. And we have to have all of our hearings held publicly. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Excuse me, Julie, are we on the
yes.
correct slide? We just had a little glitch. Sorry about that.
Yes, we are. Thank you, Paul. I
Apologize.
No worries. So what are we authorized to hear? Again, everything is set forth in the Health and Safety Code. That's why you see those sections cited there. Mostly we issue variances. The second most prevalent matter we hear are abatement orders. And beginning in January of 2018, we can issue emergency orders for abatement, but we haven't had that opportunity yet. And the third thing, which we'll hear maybe once or twice a year, are resolving permit disputes through the appeal process and also the denial of ERCs. Next slide, please. Just as important is what we're not authorized to do. Now, obviously we can't modify rules. That's the governing board's purview. However, what I'm talking about here is the effects of our decision is what matters. So we can't have a variance or an order for abatement which would effectively modify a rule of the governing board. And for the next one is very similar, exempting a business from a rule. We have no ability to do that. All of our variances and orders for abatement have very limited time, and they're just meant to bring a facility into compliance as quickly as possible. We can't impose penalties, and we can't review or overrule notices of violation, which we have been asked to do in the past. The bottom line essentially is we cannot hear anything that is not specifically authorized in the Health and Safety Code. Next slide, please. What do our hearings look like? They resemble a courtroom, but they are somewhat different. So facilities are often represented by attorneys, but they are not required to be. So we hear a lot of matters brought by small businesses or local government not represented, and we'll help you through the process. And the executive officer is always represented by district counsel. Witnesses are sworn in, they're examined just like a courtroom, but hearing board members can ask questions. Evidence is offered and received, but we are not required to follow the rule of evidence. So for example, we can accept hearsay evidence. The hearing board deliberates and votes publicly, and there is no closed session. Next slide, please. Variances. So I'm going to go through that next. So next slide, please. So what is a variance? A variance is essentially temporary relief from the requirements of a district rule or regulation or the conditions of a permit if the board can make certain findings, which we refer to as the 6 findings. I'm going to go through that in a minute. I call it a get out of jail free card, but to be very clear, it allows facilities that are without fault, and that's very important, to continue operating out of compliance for a specified amount of time without penalty under prescribed conditions, which become part of the variance. And it may require payment of excess emission fees if there are excess emissions. Next slide, please. So these are some examples of when a variance may be needed. You have a breakdown of well-maintained equipment, again, no fault. There is an unexpected delay in meeting a rule deadline because of technology forcing rules, or currently fire conditions, emergency conditions. That fire is a very prominent condition this time of year. We have a lot of emergency variances. Next slide, please. How do you get to the hearing board? Well, for a variance, they are always initiated by the facility. They become the petitioner. You fill out a petition. It's on our website, sets out the petitioner's case, answers questions that are designed to help us make the 6 findings. Then there's a filing fee. The hearing is set and the notice period begins. Next slide, please. For small businesses, the last page, and I have it up here, the last page of the petition allows for qualifying small businesses to request a reduction in filing fees on the variance petition. And that's very helpful for very small businesses. Next slide, please. So these are the types of variances that we will deal with and we can issue. The first 2, the emergency and the interim, are short in duration and no public notice is required. Then there is what's called a short variance. That has a 90-day maximum, and it has 10-day required posted notice, and that means it's posted on a bulletin board right outside the hearing board room and also on the website. Regular variance is greater than 90 days, and it requires 30-day published notice in a newspaper of general circulation. Group variances, we don't hear a lot of them, but it's when there are a lot of sources, for example, gas stations or dry cleaners that have very similar fact patterns and want the same variance type of relief. And we have rules and procedures for that in our hearing board rules. And then the final one is different from all the rest. It's called a product variance, whereas all of the other variances are facility and source specific. A product variance applies to things like coatings or hot water heaters or furnaces that are throughout the district. Next slide, please. I just wanted to touch on the emergency and interim variances. This is when there's an unanticipated breakdown event and there's not enough time for public notice. So it may be granted ex parte, which means it's handled solely by the chair and there is no hearing. But I wanted to point out that there are additional findings that need to be made in order to grant an emergency or an interim variance, because we have to be able to find that there's good cause to hear the matter without notice to the public. And we take notice to the public very seriously. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to briefly go over the 6 findings for a variance because, again, that's mostly what we hear. The first one is very straightforward. The facility is or will be in violation of a rule or regulation. Otherwise, you wouldn't really need a variance. Next slide, please. The second finding is broken down into 2 parts, and this is where we focus most of the hearing, most of the evidence is on these findings, which is circumstances leading to the violation were beyond the facility's reasonable control, again, without fault, and that requiring compliance would result in a taking or a practical closing of a business. This is the harm that the business will incur if a variance isn't given. Next slide. So here's a couple of examples of when beyond reasonable control can be found. A facility performed regular maintenance, but there was an accidental explosion or breakdown, something happened, but they just couldn't foresee it and they were well-maintained equipment. The facility installed a new state-of-the-art equipment, but it's not consistently meeting the emission limits due to manufacturer error. It's not the facility's fault and it's something brand new. Next slide, please. Here are some equally important examples when it is not beyond a reasonable control. The facility did not make reasonable effort to comply or tried not to get caught. We've seen that before. Facility never read its permit or otherwise didn't know of a rule of requirement. Generally speaking, that is not beyond reasonable control. Facility has not done proper maintenance. We want to see that all equipment is being kept up well. Or sometimes a facility will come in and say, it was my employee, it was my consultant, it was my contractor. We include everyone who works with the facility to be part of the facility. Next slide, please. Additional considerations are given when something is called an essential public service. Now that's where a petitioner is a public agency, local business, local government, and we will ask, would requiring immediate compliance impose an unreasonable burden on an essential public service? And we look at that when we're looking at whether there's beyond reasonable control and also the harm to the business. Next slide, please. Also, equally important are additional considerations in the health and safety code for small businesses. So if you qualify as a small business, of course, we've all heard of the adage, ignorance of the law is no excuse. However, if you're a small business, we do take into consideration any any reasons for which you may have had some claimed ignorance of a rule or requirements from which a variance is sought. We'll also look at your financial and other capabilities to comply. Next slide, please. The third is where we start, the third finding is where we look at the impact to the environment, impact to nearby residents, people, and health. So we're looking at, it's kind of a weighing and balancing. If the taking, which we talked about, which is the harm to the facility, is without a corresponding benefit in reducing air contaminants. So we're going to look at excess emissions. We're going to look at what type of emissions they are. Are they toxic? How close are people? And what is the amount? And we're going to do a weighing and balancing. The fourth finding is whether curtailment was considered in lieu of a variance. Variance is last resort. So if you could have reduced your throughput and not have to come and ask for a variance, we would rather see that. So we could not make that finding. Next slide, please. The fifth finding is excess emissions are reduced to the maximum extent possible or feasible. And so we're going to be looking at mitigation that's been proposed, whether there's additional mitigation that could be imposed, and we're going to impose that through conditions of the variance. And finally, there needs to be monitoring of any excess emissions. Next slide, please. So that's variances in a nutshell. Orders for abatement, next slide, is the other type of case we hear very often. This is where a company either will not or cannot comply with rules, or an entity, but cannot qualify for a variance. And usually it's because we cannot make the finding of beyond reasonable control. So I call this the flip side of a variance. In this kind of a matter, in order for abatement, the district is always the petitioner, and the district has the burden of proof. Orders for abatement will either order a facility to shut down immediately, or more often, comply with prescribed conditions that we put into the order, which are designed to reach rule compliance as quickly as possible. Next slide. An order for abatement has the same effect as any enforceable rule or regulation. NOVs can be issued, and an order for abatement is not a variance. Again, the source is not exempt from continuing penalties. Next slide. Very quickly, there are two types of orders for abatement. The first type, contested, is very rare, and that's essentially where the facility denies a violation and the board is tasked with getting evidence of and finding a violation, as well as good cause to issue an order with prescribed conditions and ways to get them into compliance. And then the second, which is what we hear more often, is what's called a stipulated order for abatement, where the facility and the district agree to the factual findings and conditions of the order, and the facility does not need to admit a violation. Next slide, please. And finally, the last type of hearing that we will have is the rarest, which are appeals. So there are several types of appeals which are set forth and we get jurisdiction from the Health and Safety Code. The first is if you are a facility and you receive a permit and you're not happy with a condition, you may appeal that condition. The second type is if you are a facility and you have been denied a permit altogether, you may appeal that denial. Or you may be a third party and a permit was granted to a facility and you have an opportunity to appeal that. So we've heard third-party appeals from schools where a permit was given to a facility that is really close to that school and impacts that school. We've also heard third-party appeals from, for example, competitors, where a facility was given a permit and the competitor feels it wasn't properly granted. And the third type is refusal of ERCs, and we've had, I think, one of those in my tenure on the board. I've been on the board for 11 years. And finally, I just wanted to point out that the standard of review on an appeal is very deferential to the executive officer. It's a very high standard of review, and the burden of proof is on the petitioning party. And the question is, did the executive officer act properly in making the decision? So essentially, just acted as he or she would normally act in either granting, denying, or whatever type of action he or she took. And that's basically the overview. And the next slide is if anyone has any questions, because that was a very truncated version of this presentation. So I don't know if anything was left out.
Well, thank you very much. It was a great presentation and a lot there. And boy, I wish I had that presentation when I first got on the board. That's the type of presentation that fills in a lot of blanks. And you know, I'm glad we record these meetings and put them out to YouTube. And I'm going to also encourage my fellow board colleagues as they come onto the board or new board members, they should hear that presentation. So thank you very much. Now we do have quite a few questions coming up from our committee here. So first up, I see Bill Lamar, followed by David, and then Todd. Bill, go ahead.
Thank you. I have a question, more of a clarification. In several of your slides, particularly number 17, you were talking about the taking of a business or practical closing of a business. And my recollection of a taking is when a government encroaches or occupies someone's land or business, or occupies real property, and yet you say practical closing of a business. So what is your definition of a taking?
Sure, it's a really good question. And again, I tried to put this presentation together so that I could get through it quickly within the time frame that was given. So that is not exactly how the Health and Safety Code defines it. It says there's two different possibilities. Number one is an unreasonable taking of property. So that means we define that as lost profits. We define that as, for example, if there are no excess emissions, and let me give you an example. A piece of equipment is broken down. And so the variance is only from having to do a source test or some other kinds of test, and they can't do it. And so they need a variance. But there are no excess emissions. But for every day that they are out of violation, they are subject to penalties from the district. That also could be a taking. Or it could just be that something's out of order, some piece of equipment, and they need to bring it back online. And to do that, they need a variance. And if we deny the variance, the taking is of that equipment or of, again, lost profits. So that's how we define that. And then separately is an essential closing of a lawful business. That's, you know, if we denied the variance and as a result, there is just simply no variance, there is no business left, that would be a closing of a business. I hope that explains it better.
Is that definition that you just articulated shown anywhere in any of the district's documents or hearing board documents? Because it's kind of complex, and as I say, I'm sure that I'm not the only one that would have a problem with my understanding of a taking or the customary definition of a taking.
Let me find, oh, here it is. Okay. I'm going to read to you exactly what it says. This is that, I have my printout that I use for my hearing. So this is the health and safety code. It's 42351, I believe, is the findings we need to make for a variance. And that finding, which is finding number 2, is exactly, I'm going to read it word for word. That due to conditions beyond the reasonable control of the petitioner, requiring compliance would result in either A, an arbitrary or unreasonable taking of property, or B, the practical closing and elimination of a lawful business. Then it goes on to say, in making those findings where the petitioner is a public agency, and that's where I talked about the essential public service, and we're talking about, in that case, it's defining a taking or a practical closing, but whatever that is, it's defining it as imposing an unreasonable burden on an essential public service. And we're talking about schools and prisons and landfills and sewage treatment, water delivery, those kinds of things. So that's where it is defined. And from there, like a court of law, we interpret it.
You said Health and Safety Code 42351?
Yeah, I'm hoping I'm getting it right. Pretty sure it's 42351. If not, it's 42352. But unfortunately, I don't. But 42351, I believe it is.
All right. Thank you very much.
Of course. There were other questions?
Yeah, David Rothbard, go ahead, David.
Yes, thank you. I want to thank you for that presentation. It was very helpful. I don't think I've ever seen a presentation on the hearing board, so I think a lot of people find that useful. So thank you very much for the presentation. Question, actually, wanted to get your feedback on maybe recommendations for a hypothetical situation. I represent essential public services, wastewater treatment plants specifically, and there's a lot of angst about public safety power shutoffs where you need to run your generator because the power is being shut off. And we have certain limits on those generators. And we get concerned if we go over the 200 hours we have in our permit, we'll need relief. Hypothetically, if that happens to 50 facilities, we don't want everyone going in and asking for a variance all at once. You get overloaded at the hearing board. My question is, what would the process be, or what would you recommend for a group variance or a group stipulated order? Is there anything that might be helpful for both sides?
Sure, there is always the group variance, and when you do that, you would file a single petition. But and it's very specific. So if you go to our hearing board rules and regulations, which you can always find. So if you go to the AQMD website under the About tab and you find the hearing board, once you go onto the hearing board tab, then we have sub-tabs or whatever you call them. And there's one with all of the relevant rules. And in there you can find our rules and procedures. And there's a lot of specifications. You need to get declarations from each of the entities that want to join. And it really has to make sense for it to be a group variance, meaning all of the relevant facts that we would look at for the 6 findings really have to have them all in common. And when you're talking about something so fact specific as the use of individual generators, I don't think a group variance is going to be the best bet, because every single entity or agency that you're talking about is going to have had different reasons why it used its generator at different times during the year, and why each of them are going over their 200-hour limit. I would just suggest that when it happens, that you do apply for, well, if it's very close to going over 200, you'd have to go for an emergency. But to the greatest extent possible, try to anticipate that and go for, you'd have to go for a regular variance, probably, because it would be more than 90 days. And those we can take pretty quickly, but there would have to be real reasons for it that are beyond your usual usage. Like, we've had many of those due to fire. So some of the remote, and a lot of them are also public uses. So if we've seen like remote antennas or whatever you would call them, where 911 relies on them, but they're so remote that power has been cut off because of a fire and the generators are certainly going to go over. So we would have to individually weigh and balance all of those because, as you say, it's not the overrunning of the hearing board, but we don't want lots of generators overwhelming all of the gains that have been made by the district. So we take it very seriously to really balance each one and make sure each one is meritorious.
Maybe as a different mechanism, would a stipulated order for abatement be better if the air district staff would agree with something? Would that be a little better mechanism for that type of situation?
You would want to be careful of that because orders for abatement are punitive. So they're not to be taken lightly. I understand that there are ramifications of being under an order for abatement that go beyond the hearing board, but I don't know exactly what they are and whether if they're stipulated, if those ramifications occur. But there are penalties involved, and certainly there's some stigma, I think, if you're under order for abatement. So if it's beyond the reasonable control of an entity to go over the 200 hours, absolutely you should apply for a variance.
Understood. Thank you.
Of course.
Derek, I see your hand up, but also Todd Campbell. Go ahead, Derek.
Just real quick to address David Rothbart's concerns. There was a couple bills that were introduced in Sacramento, backup generator bills that they didn't make it out of the houses of origin or failed to get out of any house. And so, but we were in discussion with many of the, for instance, the water companies, the municipal utility, California Municipal Utilities Association, hospitals on their backup generator bills. And what I'd like to do, David, is we could talk about at a different time, and we can have staff give you a call, but talk to you about the negotiations that we did with them.
And I'm actually, so you don't have to spend too much time. I'm aware of exactly what you're talking about. So I appreciate that, Derek, and we can always talk offline. I just was curious about the scenario, what the hearing board can or cannot do.
Thank you for that. Mr. Todd Campbell.
Thank you.
Nice to see you.
It's nice to see you too. I was going to say, I've known Julie probably for 19, 20 years. And it's great to see you. You haven't aged a day. I don't know how you do it. But as you can see, Julie is incredibly competent, articulate. She knows her stuff, and we're very lucky to have her for 11 more years. 11 years, and I hope we get her for another 11 more if she's willing. But I'm very proud of the fact that she's, leading the group, and it's very clear to me that we're in very good hands. Thank you for your dedication and all that you do. And it's too bad this, with COVID, that I can't see you in person, because it would be great to chat more. But thank you for everything.
Thank you. I would have liked that too.
Was there a question in there, Todd?
Yeah, it was, how does she look the same after 20 years?
Good lighting.
All right. Any other comments or questions on this item? If not, again, Julie, thank you. Great presentation. And like I said, this is one of the parts of the board that I have to spend a lot of time explaining to people that, are not quite as familiar with the Air District as a lot of other people are that are in business, but it's a very important part of the board, and I appreciate all your hard work there, and keep it up. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me for that reason.
Thanks. All right, with that, we'll go ahead and go on to the next item. Discussion on the overview of Rule 1407. And who's going to be presenting this? Yusin Wu?
Win-win.
Sorry.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Win Vo. I'm a program supervisor in planning and rules, and today I'll be providing a quick summary of Rule 1407. Next slide, please. So Rule 1407 is one of our industry-specific air toxic rules. Rule 1407 regulates 3 carcinogens: arsenic, cadmium, and nickel from non-ferrous metal melting. Non-ferrous metals include metals such as aluminum, copper, brass, and bronze, and are melted in furnaces, as you see here. Once they're melted, then they get poured into molds and cast into products or different shapes and ingots. Next slide, please, Paul. So this process does have the potential to emit toxic air contaminants and are addressed by point source controls, housekeeping, and enclosures. Point source controls reduce emissions at the source, the furnace itself. Housekeeping and cleaning will minimize the amount of fugitive dust that can become airborne. And then lastly, we have enclosures, which minimize the potential for these fugitives to leave the building enclosure itself. Next slide, Paul. So here's a general overview of the structure of Rule 1407, and now I'll go into detail for each of these sections. Next slide. The first provisions are for our point source control requirements. There are 3 emission limits in Rule 1407, 1 each for arsenic, cadmium, and nickel. And then each toxic air contaminant does have the option of 2 emission limits. You can either use the control efficiency that is calculated per furnace, or you can meet what we're calling the aggregate mass emission limit for each contaminant, which is the mass emission limit of all the furnaces that are melting non-chromium metals at a facility. Having these 2 options allows the facility to regulate as they please. For example, if you have 1 large furnace with a lot of emissions, you can put controls on that, and then you can leave your other furnaces uncontrolled. And then additionally, for a third option, facilities do have the option to opt out of these emission limits if their health risk assessment or air toxics inventory reports show that below certain thresholds. Next slide, please. So controlling fugitive emissions is a really important aspect of this rule and many of our other toxic rules. During the rule development for Rule 1420.1 for lead acid battery facilities, staff found that fugitive emissions actually significantly elevate ambient levels at our monitors. So in order to deal with these fugitive emissions, Rule 1407 has a comprehensive building enclosure and housekeeping measures. For the building enclosure requirements, it's required that all metal melting operations, melting, casting, grinding, cutting, occurs within a building. So what we consider a building enclosure is having to minimize your cross stress. There cannot be 2 openings that are opposite sides of each other. So the rule requires that at least one of these openings is closed. And they can be closed by things such as strip curtains, roll-up doors, or even other large equipment that can be used as barriers to block the flow from one end of the building to the other. And then as for housekeeping measures, the first set of housekeeping measures has to do with storing material that has the potential to create fugitive dust, either in enclosed storage areas, in the building enclosure, or in closed containers. And then as for the cleaning requirements and housekeeping measures, there's certain periodic provisions that are required to clean using an approved cleaning method, such as using a HEPA vacuum or wet cleaning methods of specific areas. Those specific areas are the actual cutting, melting, grinding areas themselves, entryways of building enclosures, or places where accidents have happened. For both the building enclosure requirements and housekeeping measures, the rule does allow for alternative measures as long as they're approved in a compliance plan. Next slide, please.
Win-win. Before you continue, you know what? I don't know if it's just me or others, but you're coming up broken up a lot. So maybe that you're taking a lot of bandwidth. You want to close your video, stop your video, and see if that works, because sometimes that does work. I'll let you know if it helps out.
Thanks, Derek. She was coming
I
across.
was getting the
top.
same thing. So thank you. Yes, I thought it was me, maybe.
Go ahead, Win-Win.
All right, thanks, Derek. So Rule 1407 has several testing and monitoring requirements. The first is periodic source testing every 60 months This ensures that the emission limits in the rule are being met, and if a facility has control devices, that their collection efficiency limits are also being met. In between source testing, there are continuous and more frequent monitoring, which ensures that the equipment is being operated and maintained properly. It is also a good indicator for facilities that their equipment is not working, and they get notified of it almost immediately. And then lastly, there's material testing, which requires testing of the raw materials for arsenic, cadmium, nickel to ensure that these contaminants are within the limits of the rule. Next slide, please. The last section of the rule is exemptions. The last amendment we did in 2019, we made these we made these exemptions more stringent. As they were previously written, they were very broad and allowed a lot of facilities to opt to be exempt from the emission limits. So the first exemption that we revised was we're phasing out what is called the clean aluminum scrap exemption. This allowed for facilities that utilize clean aluminum scrap to be exempt from the emission limits, but the provision didn't require any sort of concentration limits for arsenic, cadmium, or nickel. So it didn't help protect the community since we weren't looking at the arsenic, cadmium, and nickel concentrations. So as of January 1st, 2021, this exemption will be removed. And then for the metal or alloy purity exemption, it originally only had a limit for arsenic and cadmium, but didn't have a throughput limit. So the amendment included a throughput limit of 8,400 tons per year. And this makes it so that those large facilities, even though they're melting alloys with very low concentrations of arsenic and cadmium, with a high throughput, they may be potentially exposing the surrounding communities. So we put, in addition to the arsenic and cadmium limit, a throughput limit on it. Next slide, please. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm available to answer any questions.
Thanks, Win-Win. That did help when you turned off your video, because I guess you were using too much bandwidth.
It did help. Good recommendation. Thank you, Derek.
Thanks, Derek.
Rita, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, hello. I just had a clarifying question. How many facilities are you looking at that are going to be impacted by this rule? And then what types of facilities are they? Like, what are they manufacturing?
So there are about 60 facilities that are impacted by this rule, although a majority of them would fall under one of our exemptions and really only have to do housekeeping, record keeping, and the building enclosures. And then, I'm sorry, Rita, what was the second part of your question?
What types of facilities, like what kind of manufacturing, what kind of product are they putting out?
From what we've seen, they range from everything from, pure ingots that other facilities are using, some art and sculpture type pieces. And then we've also seen, parts for manufacturing of different industries. I think oil and well industry is one that we see often, aerospace sometimes.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rita.
Any other questions, anyone? Not seeing any. All right. Thank you very much. It was a great presentation and a good update. All right. With that, we're on to our written reports that are attached. Does anyone have any questions on the written reports? Everyone must be ready to go get lunch since we don't have lunch waiting for us. All right. We have any other business from the members of the board? I see Bill Amar, you got your hand raised. Bill?
Yeah, thank you. I had been reserving this. I guess I have a request more than anything else, and I had been reserving it to raise at the Home Rule Advisory Group, but it seems like the district has abandoned Home Rule. We haven't met for, I guess, over a year now. Whether they've lost interest in it or not. But anyway, my request since we had such an excellent presentation about the hearing board, I would like to suggest that we have a similar presentation on CAPCOA. I would venture to say that the majority of this committee or this advisory group's members don't even know what CAPCOA is, what they do, who they are, much less that Wayne is the current president. But I think it's particularly timely since the ARB has several regulations coming out here in the next few months dealing with much of what Win-Win was just talking about, toxic air contaminants, maybe 1,000 of them. And it's going to affect all 35 air districts, particularly South Coast. So I think it would be, certainly my suggestion if we could have either their executive director or someone else give us a better understanding of not only their involvement in these two issues, but what they do as an association and how it affects rulemaking in California and in the South Coast District.
Derek, I see your hand raised and I see a lot of heads nodding. So what can you tell us, Derek?
So just real quickly, CAPCOA is an umbrella group of all the air pollution control officers in the state, but it stands for the California Air Pollution Control Officers Association. Let us talk to Tung Lee, who heads up, he's executive director for CAPCOA, and either that or Wayne will give the presentation. But let us check first.
Derek, just as FYI, I was just talking to Tung yesterday about the issue that Bill's talking about. So Tung's aware of it, and Tracy Goss is involved as well. So both of those individuals might be helpful.
Yeah, well, just like at any organization, you go to the president first, and then go to the executive officer. So I'm going to check with our executive officer, Wayne, who's the president of CAPCOA right now, and just see how he wants to handle it.
Very good. All right, Rita, I see your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to support Bill. I am familiar somewhat with CAPCOA, but I would really be interested to hear what specific issues they are working on. And I guess, in principle, it's kind of concerning where regulatory agencies are sort of, for lack of better words, pushing a certain regulatory agenda. And so, yes, it would be very interesting to hear about what CAPCOA's positions are. Thank you.
Very good. Unless there's something else, that brings us to the public comment period. Do we have any public comment for members of the public? For items not on the agenda? Not seeing any hands raised on the attendee side. All right, with that, what brings us to the end of our meeting. Our next meeting will be Friday, October 9th at 11:30. Thank you all for attending, and we'll look forward to seeing you then.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.